Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, dear audience. I'm from the Faculty of Architecture. My name is Renata, and I will be moderating this morning's session on history, Alberti Palladio. The topic of this panel is interesting for us today because with the Renaissance, a new modern era begins. From Alberti and Palladio started systematic learning from the past, systematic writing about architecture, attachment to visual, the concepts of authorship and disciplinarity in architecture. Almost everything that we have been talking about for the last 2 days is mentioned for the first time in Alberti. Alberti and Palladio also, as we've heard yesterday more than once, influenced Mr. Eisenman's architectural thinking too. I have a great pleasure to welcome our distinguished and dear guest, and I will give just a very, very short and brief introduction about each of them. So together with Mr. Eisenman, in this session, we will hear first Mr. Jörg Gleiter, who is coming from Technische University Berlin, who is an architect, holds a PhD in architectural theory and habilitation in philosophy of architecture. He is author of many books on architectural theory, philosophy, and aesthetics. We will also hear Mr. Emmanuel Petit, who is coming from Yale School of Architecture, who is an architect, writer, and teacher. His latest book is on irony, and one of the chapters in this book is dedicated to Mr. Eisenman and his relation to the philosophical notion of irony. He is also married with a Bulgarian girl, and he told us that he feels very comfortable in Serbia, almost at home. Our speaker will be also Mr. Mario Carpo, whom we heard yesterday, from Yale School of Architecture. He's an architectural historian, but he studied architecture and history in Italy. He has published extensively on Renaissance architectural theory, history, and culture, as well as digital technologies. We also have a great pleasure to hear Mr. Panayotis Pangalos, who is coming from Greece, who is an architect and architectural historian, who worked or have been working at many universities. University of Patra, Technical Institution of Patra, Hellenic Open University, Athens School of Fine Art, and his recent books are The Significance of Time in Contemporary Architecture, The Significance of Time in Architecture of Aldo Rossi, I Work So I Live, and the latest one, The Imprint of Eisenman. And he is here, I quote, only for Peter. So audience, please, let's give a warm welcome to all our guests, and let's listen to Mr. Gleiter's presentation. Welcome all.
Well, good morning. You can hear me? Yeah. So, history, Alberti Palladio. This is the topic of our session this morning. So, before we start the discussion, I would like to bring up one question and get a little bit deeper into it. A question that, at least to me, seems to be central to the architectural discourse in regard to history. So the question is, what do we architects, theorists, philosophers, or historians exactly mean when we talk about history? It may be a particular obsession of mine, but I'm convinced that history is always based on a certain theory of history. And furthermore, that as a necessary prerequisite, theory of architecture must be based on a theory of history. Although, much to my disappointment in discussions with theorists, philosophers, and architects, normally there is no explicit mention of the underlying theory of history. It is taken for granted. History seems to be simple, theory instead complex and difficult. And I'm not really convinced about this, so please let me outline some principles of the theory of history, which may or may not serve as a basis for the discussions to follow. So, 3 propositions I would like to present. So, truly innovative architectural practice changes the past as much as it changes the future. Second, as a factual entity, the past precedes the present time, yet it is only a posteriori, only in retrospect, that the past turns into history. And thirdly, whatever innovative architectural practice there is, truly innovative it is if it succeeds in effecting history with the seeds of its own ideas. And I believe that Peter Eisenman's architecture practice over the years has changed our understanding of the history of architecture, as it has changed the future course of architecture as well. So please let me elaborate on this in order to stay within the given 20 minutes limit. I will try to be as concise as possible. So I should like to begin my exploration of the theory of history by citing some lines from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe from the beginning of the 19th century. So in a statement frightening in its radicality even today, Goethe stated in the context of his color theory that from time to time world history must be rewritten. So you see it here. Of that, there is surely no longer any doubt, he says. But this need is not a consequence, for instance, of how much had happened has lately been discovered, but because new opinions prevail, because those who are born in a progressive era arrive at a point that allows them to view and evaluate the past in an entirely new way. This is Nietzsche. This is Goethe. So the underlying motive, however, was not that new material has been discovered or new facts have appeared, but that in times of steady change, the time witness is led to a new point of view, offering a new look at the past and eventually leading to its re-evaluation. History, Goethe suggests, is a matter of perspective. It is dependent on the point of view of a given age. As the historian Reinhard Koselleck puts it, the reflexive realization of one's own changing point of view, that's what he says, also casts past events in a new light, knowing though that the historical facts have not changed. So in opposition to the Hegelian, at the time most prominent theory of history, Goethe took the view that traditions were by no means simply handed down from one generation to the next. On the contrary, each generation has to make its own claims on the past, on the basis of its own cultural context. That means that as a factual entity, the past precedes the present time, yet it is only a posteriori, only in retrospect, that the past turns into history. In of itself, no past fact is historical. Only from a present-day perspective, decades or even centuries later, do past facts turn into historical facts. Thus, history exists only as history a posteriori. Here, Walter Benjamin's philosophical ideas on history picked up the threads of Goethe. Benjamin's central and, in respect to Goethe, once more radicalized thesis is that modernity in no way denies history. On the contrary, he noticed certain correspondences, as he says, between the world of modern technology and the symbolic world of mythology, and held that modernity distinguishes itself from previous epochs by its special relationship with history. Paradoxically, modernity's orientation towards the future, according to him, mainly serves the goal of reconnecting the present back to prehistory. In its drive for innovation, modernity is permanently in search for what he calls the historical index of its advanced and therefore at first unprecedented cultural practices. Eventually, in the 1970s, Benjamin's philosophy of history affected architecture theory on a broader scale. For example, in his book, Le Corbusier, The Noble Savage, Adolphe Max Vogt took up Benjamin's idea of modernity's search for the historical index. Vogt holds that modernity is reflected, I quote, in the origins like Narcissus is reflected in the pond, end of quote. By this, he referred to Le Corbusier's boîte en l'air, the white box suspended on pilotis, as exemplified by Le Corbusier's two houses, for example, at the Weißenhof-Siedlung in Stuttgart. According to Vogt, Le Corbusier considered pile dwellings an architectural archetype, or an archetypical architectural form. The new construction technologies and the new material concrete, or the ferroconcrete, had allowed Le Corbusier to turn back to the stilt house as a quintessential archetype of modern architecture. This is Vogt. The Swiss frenzy for the stilt house, which was caused by the 1854 discovery on the shore of Lake Zurich and Lake Neuchâtel, had continued to have an effect on Le Corbusier, eventually leading to his modern dreams of origins. Again, this is Vogt. Undoubtedly, in his book, Vogt contributes greatly to the understanding of modernity's relation to the history of architecture. The metaphor of modernity being reflected, once again, in the origins, like Narcissus in the pond, does not, however, do justice to modernity, since no present time is ever simply reflected in origins. The opposition is true, that modernity tends to declare as origin that past cultural practice in which it sees reflected its present practice. Origin is what modernity recognizes in the past as corresponding to its own practice. Origin is that to which the present is susceptible, as Benjamin writes. History is never just there. Only at certain times will certain past forms become readable and thus recognizable as origins. As Benjamin held, I quote, each now is a now of a certain readability, end of quote. Only after having built a white box on pilotis was Le Corbusier able to discover the house on piles as a historical index to modern advanced architectural practice. The house on piles, considered as an origin to modern architecture, is a discovery of Le Corbusier a posteriori. It's an invention, but a meaningful invention. That means that truly innovative design must make visible in the past something that we can only see from the perspective of today. Now we can also better understand Le Corbusier, especially the title of his chapter, Eyes Which Do Not See, in his book Towards a New Architecture. In this chapter, he reproaches his fellow architects and engineers for not searching in history for the seeds of their innovative architectural practice, thus falling short of understanding the concept of history in modernity. In the same chapter, he boldly compares the Parthenon temple to the most advanced and most symbolic of modern machines, the automobile. In the chapter Architecture, Pure Creation of the Mind, one of the captions read, I quote, here is something to arouse emotion. We are in the inexorable realm of the mechanical, end of quote. Yet another caption reads, all this plastic machinery is realized in marble with the rigor that we have learned to apply in the machine. The impression is of naked, polished steel. But with this, he was not referring to the automobile, but to the Parthenon. Eventually, it was the precision of the modern machine that had opened his eyes and caused him to discover some modern aspect in the Greek temple that had given him the impression of naked, polished steel. Le Corbusier had discovered less a formal than a conceptual correspondence between the mechanical precision of the machine and the stone cutting, between modern design and classical architecture. Only after establishing the principles of modern architecture beforehand was it possible that Le Corbusier became aware of some modern aspects in the Greek temple. With the idea of a corresponding past, Le Corbusier tried to place his innovative practice into the broader context of architecture history. He hoped to integrate into the history of architecture the modern practices of building in iron and ferroconcrete that, on account of their extreme innovation at the time, so far were all but considered pure engineering. With Theodor Adorno, we can hold that modernity exhibits a dialectics of the newest and the oldest. Much of Benjamin's inspiration, though, was owed to Siegfried Giedion, especially to the book Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferroconcrete. He quotes from Giedion that by replacing ornament in the 19th century, the iron and steel construction had assumed, what he said, the role of the subconsciousness. For Giedion, though, it is the historian rather than the architect who takes the lead in the search for the Benjaminian historical index. It is up to him to find in history the seeds, and this is a term he used, the seeds of innovative architectural practice. In spite of all formal ruptures and breaks, the historian must search the seeds of present-day innovative and thus so far historically unconditioned architectural practice. With Giedion, we can conclude that whatever innovative architectural practice there is, it is only truly innovative if it succeeds in infecting history with the seeds of its own advanced ideas. That means that contrary to previous epochs, modernity features a technique of what I would call a double reversed identity. A source of modern identity is only what can identify in the past aspects of its own advanced practice, and what succeeds in making visible a line of development from the past towards its own, at first unconditioned practice. Searching for the seeds, though, does not mean the large-scale reconstruction of history. We may rather talk of an act of infecting the past with the present in retrospect. So this is also at the core of the Bauhaus. Walter Gropius had clearly formulated the outlines of a double reverse construction of history in 1926. In Principles of Bauhaus Production, he states, I quote, and you can read it here, "It is only through constant contact with newly evolving techniques, with the discovery of new materials and new construction techniques, that the creative individual can learn to bring the objects into a living relationship with tradition." Once again, I think this is very important for us here. It is only through constant contact with newly evolving techniques, with the discovery of new materials and new construction techniques, that the creative individual can learn to bring the objects into a living relationship with tradition. Gropius saw design and architectural praxis at the Bauhaus in terms of a dialectical relationship between the past and the future, onwards to tradition. This is what he also termed. What Gropius proposed for innovative architecture could also be described as a retroactive avant-garde practice. In other words, even avant-garde practice is directed as much, every avant-garde practice is directed as much towards the past as it is to the future. This means, I quote not someone else, but it's not important to mention him in this context here, but it means traditions don't lead, as perfectly sensible people believe, from the past history into the present, but from the present back into a web of historical circumstances insofar as these come together as history. Tradition is therefore not about deriving today from yesterday, but the other way around, for traditions arise from a present-day perspective on the past. The historical avant-garde movement did not contemptuously break with tradition. There were not wild, disrespectful forces destroying traditions, but were in fact the forces that created traditions, as long as they managed to allow the new to show through in the old. Avant-garde only applies to those things that prompt us to see the supposed bastions of tradition with new eyes, that is to say, to construct new traditions. The new makes us see the old in a new light. So the function of the new today is to appropriate the old to which we would otherwise have no access. Of course, the new is also the unknown, and hence often a source of fear, whereas historical factors are believed to be well known, certain, and familiar. But this is not a reason to fear the avant-garde. On the contrary, we ought to fear the disappearance of innovative cultural production. We have to fear the disappearance of avant-garde practice. Those who seek to shut it down are the ones who should truly be filled with fear, for they are in danger to lose precisely what they believe they have strongest hold of, namely tradition. For it bears repeating, the word innovative practice only applies to those things that prompt us to see the supposed bastions of tradition with new eyes, that is to say, to construct new traditions. This explains why societies that see the innovative cultural practices as a threat and try to stop it, in fact, achieve precisely the opposite. Instead of securing traditions, they lose them and find themselves threatened with disintegration. After all, wasn't it Le Corbusier's love for precision engineering, ocean liners, cars, aeroplanes, that made him notice the precision of the construction of the Parthenon and the clearness of its edges? It was Le Corbusier's avant-garde architectural practice that put him in the position to trace a new line of tradition from antiquity to his own innovative architectural practice, to modern architecture, which in turn was no longer without tradition, despite its iconoclastic dismissals of its immediate past. So time and again, mention is made of the immanent classicism of the architecture of Mies van der Rohe and the reminiscences of Schinkel's classicism in Mies architecture. But it would be entirely misleading to suggest that Mies van der Rohe took his lead from Schinkel's classicism and, as it were, transposed into modernism. That would constitute a relapse into an all-too-simplistic model of history with an all-too-simplistic model of historical causalities. For the real significance of the Neue Nationalgalerie, for example, is that Mies' handling of steel, glass, and stone, of space and light, suddenly allows us to discern the modern traits in Schinkel's classicism. It is through the architecture of Mies van der Rohe that we see in Schinkel's design aspects of a modern approach that we would otherwise have been incapable of recognizing. It was Mies van der Rohe and his architecture that made it possible for us, retroactively, that means looking back to the past, to draw a line from architecture from the 1980s around to architecture in the machine age of the 20th century. So it is the secret of truly significant, and now I come to the end, it is the secret of truly significant innovative architectural practice that it manages, firstly, to infect history with the seed of its own praxis, and secondly, to instigate a new line of tradition leading from history to its own practice. And here we see the dialectics of modernism. Truly innovative architectural practice always changes the past as much as it influences the future. So in this slide, we may turn to these discussions now on the historical implications of Peter Eisenman's work, to the discussion of history, Alberti, and Palladio. If you allow, I would like to add a little bit to this. I think the 20 minutes are over. Just maybe to make my point clear and how it is related here to Peter Eisenman's work. Schinkel and Mies, there was this really interesting, nice, and very important book coming out in the mid-1980s of Fritz Neumeier, my predecessor of the chair, at the chair of architecture theory. And he was trying to show that in Mies there's a lot of classicism, and that Mies was somehow deriving his architecture from classicism. I think we have to revise this point. Although the book in other parts is very interesting, I think this is not so. I think we discover, as you see here in the images, something modern in Schinkel through Mies. Schinkel did not know that this is modern. So we need the architecture of Mies in order to discern something modern in Schinkel. And this is how Schinkel becomes part of our tradition. If that would be not possible, Schinkel would stay some remote, old-fashioned architecture, and we would not have to deal anymore with him. It would be nice architecture, maybe, but nothing more. So it's important that Mies is somehow the key in order to discern something modern in Schinkel and not the other way around. And I think that similar things is also, you know, I know I was talking mainly referring to modern architecture, but the same applies to the digital and, for example, Alberti. And I think we will get some interesting talk and comment from Mario Carpo, who will probably show us maybe how we can see Alberti with new eyes through the digital and the architecture of Peter Eisman. And by the way, I mentioned this also in the foreword to the translation of your book, that this is what I'm interested in. So this is very important, and maybe just I finish here. I hope that I made my point clear and that it will help maybe for the discussions. Okay, thank you very much.
After this introduction, I would like to refer immediately to a common denominator between Alberti, Palladio, and Eisenman, the concept of geometry. Considering our acquaintance, I can conclude that Eisenman is a person with a strong will and stability, but his architecture is perceived as an image of instability and ambiguity. It stands between specific and abstract, promotes the arbitrary and disputes the stereotypes, the normatives. So I believe that the means with which he goes over from the clarity to the incoherence is the geometry. He knows very well how to operate geometry because he knows how to read history in geometrical terms. Every moment of the past is for him a different geometrical order. Thus, I have two questions regarding the use of geometry by Eisenman. The first one is related to Leon Battista Alberti. In his book, De la Famiglia, Alberti presents the form of the house as a mirror of the position, the power, and the value of a family in public space, therefore in the society too. And the main point of Alberti's text is that the biggest risk of a family is the randomness. The randomness could destroy the cohesion, the harmony, and the balance of a family. At this point, the role of the house becomes decisive. In the text De la Famiglia, the term casa, house, is repeated 227 times with multiple meanings. The house, effectively and allegorically, operates as a shield of the family from outside dangers. It also offers the possibility of strengthening their ties and ideological identity of its members. According to Alberti, at the house, a political configuration management of relations and wealth is produced and reproduced on a smaller scale before applied to the entire social fabric. The urban family will follow a type of life that responds to a particular economic organization of society. So, The classical geometry of the house, along with the symmetry, the order, and the proportions, ensure the stable image of the higher urban family. On the contrary, even though Eisenman designed houses for the same higher urban class, the result is a sample of asymmetry, disorder, and imbalance, an absolute indetermination. But what does this chaotic order mean? In the late 20th century, while the structural elements of a Renaissance family remain indelible, the morphological evidence of the house appeared different from those of the 15th century. The form of the house continues to reflect the family's position in the political and cultural hierarchy of society that it belongs, but in another way. Whereas the framework of upper-class ideology within which appear the modern buildings of family is kept constant, their image seems to be removed from the concept of stability. The static structure is perfectly adequate, but it appears unable to deliver the required support. The symmetry, the pace and order have been replaced by asymmetry, arrhythmia, and disorder. Uncertainty and clutter dominate in the form of the new habitat of the new bourgeoisie. In fact, Eisenman produces the maximum sense of ambiguity with the maximum possible use of logic. He builds mess with absolute methodicalness. Everything looks accidental, disobedient to any Euclidean rule, yet all of the above are certainly produced reasonably. With the sophisticated construction of ambiguity, he deifies mathematics once more, as when the construction of clarity in Alberti's Palazzo Rucellai, in Santa Maria Novella, in San Sebastiano, or San Brancazio. Consequently, the supervision of hesitation is the new proof of dominance and confidence. The political, economical, and legal management of chaos is a future of power. Moreover, it is well known that in architecture, as a project moves away from rationalism, so the project seems broken, distorted, shifted, curved, twisted, hashed. More rational procedures are required for its construction. This is because of the complex scientific knowledge on static calculations, or because of construction costs, which implies support from the economically powerful, that this is the most rational part of society. Moving on to the next subject, onto the second subject, we ask, what does Eisenman seek in the works of Palladio? The correlation between architecture and text, the relationship between reality and utopia, the detection of the growth potential of space. In the 4 books of architecture, Palladio introduces the transformed design of his architectural suggestions. He interprets quite freely examples of Roman antiquity and architecture of the Renaissance, depicting idealized forms in existing buildings, but without avoiding to observe the elements of nature. His insistence on the rule appears alongside references to exceptions, even when they are considered to be avoided. The theoretical wording of Palladio allows the transfer of knowledge, but also the confirmation of experience. He proposes the use of classical rhythms, but also the investigation of alternative suggestions that may lead to new results. Finally, Palladio's architecture is based on principles, but permits imagination to break free of them. This claim of liberation is, in my opinion, the primary element of Peter Eisenman's architecture. In 2012, Eisenman presented his long study specifically on Palladio in an exhibition at the Yale School of Architecture. But Eisenman's references to the work of Palladio already appeared at the Biennale di Venezia of 2004. There, he presented the relationship between Palladio, Piranesi, Terragni, and his own work. In this installation, the geometries of architectural proposals of the four architects mingle with each other in order to present metaphorically the impossibility of a return to a metaphysical center. The visitor is invited to walk in a maze that was the result of merged geometrical bodies. It was a spatial fusion of Palazzo Chiericati of Palladio, the Carceri and the Collegio Romano of Piranesi, the Casa del Faso of Terragni, and House 11A of Eisenman. The result was a place without fixed route and no center. In this environment, any readability of components was lost. Any possibility of perceiving geometrical alignments, functions, symbols had been removed. The space was transformed into a diagram produced by many diagrams in a visual space where the inner and outer, up and down, the part and the whole, are unrecognizable. What does liberation from a center mean? For Andrea Palladio, geometry is a tool of space ordering with the center as the most important point. The center of the building is related to a political, religious, or economical center. The center is a fixed point around which all architectural elements are placed, depending on it as the centripetal force works in physics. On the other hand, the work of Peter Eisenman demonstrates that the architect does not use any more geometry only to organize space. The architect can question geometry, can doubt geometry, in order to secure, to guarantee his role in the social arena. As the centrifugal force allows the release from a center, in the same way, architecture confirms that into geometry, revolution could be implemented. It is more like declaring that it is achievable to destroy the language with its own weapons. Is that possible? Thank you.
Mr. Panayotis, thank you very much. We will just continue with our next presentation. It will be Mr. Emmanuel Petit. And I think we need maybe technical support here because we have another computer.
I was very entertained when I read the title for this panel because unlike the sessions yesterday, where simple keywords seemed to be descriptive enough of what the subject of the panel was going to be, you know, form, space, can you turn that on? Form, space, digital, analog, it's all simple enough, right? But this panel on history had to be further qualified with the two names Alberti Palladio, as if they were going to trigger the moment of epiphany and have us say, that's the kind of history you want us to address. So indeed, Peter's history is a specific one in that it is a history that has proper names. It is a history of proper names. And with this idea, we are on conceptual territory of somebody who wrote a book on proper names, and that is Emmanuel Levinas, who in this book describes that no subject is ever a proper subject. Propre in French means clean, of course. We are not clean subjects. We do not simply have an independent identity from other subjects in historical space, but we are inhabited by the otherness of those names he or she, the subject, can speak of, or who speaks through the subject, The improper names, which inhabited Levinas's persona as an author, included Derrida, Kierkegaard, Proust, Blanchot, amongst many others. And those are the ones he made into proper names in the first place by openly acknowledging them, by saying that he is related to them. The idea being that some names lose their independence in historical space to become shared identities and to become constitutive parts of other proper names. History is embodied by names that we ascribe to ideas. So if the question of the panel is, how does Eisenman see or conceptualize history? It is a history of proper names that include Alberti, Palladio, Serlio, Piranesi, Terrani, Mies, Le Corbusier, Walter Benjamin, Blanchot, Derrida. You know them all, you know the suspects, that's the team. Now, of course, Nietzsche was the one who suggested one of the, in my mind, most useful categorizations of different types of history. Antiquarian history, monumental, and critical. You know that well. And were we to situate Eisenman's history of proper names in Nietzsche's typology, we would fall somewhere, I think, between monumental and critical history. Monumental because being given a place in Peter's architectural history of proper names is like being given a place in the Football Hall of Fame, of course. And these names acquire more and more virtues as time goes on. These names need to be recognizable and they need to weather time. So monumental and then critical because these names stand for particular moments of crisis or change in history and judgment is passed on them. And how? Because the dialectic method towards precedent Peter uses is very simple and is described here on one of the sketches Peter did for Venice Cannaregio, and I point out that he kind of summarizes the methodology by saying show and deny. That's what it is all about. Show history and then deny it. For this brief presentation, I decided to classify, to simply classify as a way to start a discussion, some of Peter's proper names in 4 categories according to the historical function they have for him. So not all precedents are the same. Peter is not just about precedents, but there are different types of precedents. This is how I wanted to conceptualize them. So the proper names here are Le Corbusier, whose historical function I would say is the spectre, Derridian notion, as you will see. Terrani is the second proper name, and I would say he's the father figure. There's a Oedipal relationship. Piranesi is the next proper name, and I would call him the episteme. And Mies, or then Palladio, Mies a little more, is the degree 0 for architecture. So let me just briefly describe the historical conceptual function of each one of these proper names and the operations they are subjected to by Peter Eisenman. Le Corbusier is the ghost, for example in Cannaregio, in the Derridian sense of somebody who is present in his absence. Le Corbusier is, of course, the figure of authority for 20th century architecture, and that's important. He is the authority, and even though his Venice hospital was never built, it is more present than most of the built projects. And so the afterlife is, of that building and of this authority figure is very recognizable even after the cadaver has rotten away and the meat is gone. Derrida actually took this mechanism of making the absent visible, and Derrida is of course the obvious, the open source here for Peter. Derrida took this mechanism from Kierkegaard, and on your right is an image that Kierkegaard used to describe how meaningful historical ghosts become visible to us. You see the grave of Napoleon, who of course is another one of these strong authorities and strong presences in history, just like Le Corbusier. Napoleon is dead. His empty corpse is hidden behind a stone, and he's just referred to by his name on the stone. But he has an afterlife in the empty figure between the trees where he literally is not. So he appears in a place where literally he is not. That is the way how a historical figure haunts even the person looking at his grave. And in fact, in this image, Napoleon's ghost is looking at his own grave. We are all Napoleon's ghosts looking at Napoleon's grave. Just like Le Corbusier, in Peter's project, is given an afterlife, but emptied of its substance and quite literally buried into the ground at Cannaregio. So Peter is engaging Le Corbusier by showing that he once existed and displacing him, quite literally, in time and in space. Here, architecture is a way to write in somebody else's name, to be given the word by somebody else, which I think is absolutely fundamental in Eisenman. The second proper name is Terrani. Terrani is the Oedipal name. It is the kind of name who provokes the anxiety that if he is not sufficiently misread by the new poet, Peter, Peter might merely be a copy of this historical precedent. And of course, the historical function that I'm describing here is one that was described by Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence from 1973. Terrani has to be misread. Terrani's misprison turns into Peter's project here. Meaning, in this case, with this proper name, to engage history is to misread and thus make the precedent into one's own by swerving away from him. The third proper name is Piranesi. Piranesi is the episteme, the model, the guy who could balance fact and fiction, which is so central to Peter, the guy who stands for figure-figure relationships. He holds the process code of Eisenman's project that can be redeployed, reinterpreted in multiple different ways. I would say that Piranesi is, to Peter, what the notion of the bridge was for Heidegger. It is the virtual Urcode of architecture that has to be given an Auslegung. It has to be laid out, like a bridge has to be laid out in order to become a piece of architecture. Piranesi himself is not architecture yet. He has to be laid out in different ways to become architecture. And Piranesi, in observing Peter, myself, for me, feels like he's always the good guy. There is nothing bad Peter has to say about Piranesi. And that is because there is no literal translation of Piranesi. Piranesi destroys classical language from within its own metaphysical box. Meaning he shows that if you were to finish the job of building Rome according to the accepted rules of classical architecture, according to the episteme, that logic would eventually start to negate its own principles. It would start, as Kierkegaard would say, to swallow its own stomach. So Piranesi is the ambition. He is the project. And the final category of these precedents is Mies and Palladio. They are figures of the degree zero of architecture. They are the basics. They are the mathematics of architecture. 4 squares, 9 squares, 25 squares, infinite homogeneous grids. They striate the field. They are the first layer of the diagram. They are like bread in between the appetizer and the entree. With them, you cleanse the palate. If you wonder what to do first, then when thinking of a project, start here. Start with a Miesian grid and see what happens after. Proper names come with a lot of historical baggage, especially with Palladio. Palladio never comes alone, but he's attached to other proper names like Witkova Row. You know the story. And it even comes with proper names that are already prepared for in the future. Meaning you cannot become a proper name yourself if you don't prepare the ground for proper names in the future. That is a very Socratic technique that Peter masters, meaning you have to help build future proper names. Alexander Nehamas, who wrote a very interesting book on Socrates, said that to imitate Socrates is to make yourself as different from Socrates as he made himself from everybody else. So to become a true individual and hence a true proper name. So these are, in my mind, the 4 categories or the 4 typologies of Peter's historical precedents. And their critical functions that they played in his work. They are all both monumental and critical, and they embody the operations that generate Peter Eisenman's architecture, because without their proper names, architecture proper cannot emerge. For that, one hinges on its relation to historical precedents and as well as the future names Eisenman hopes to become a precedent of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emmanuel.
I shall be brief because I've already spoken a lot yesterday, and so I have very few words remaining. Moreover, I presume that I should say something on Alberti. There were two names in the title today, Alberti and Palladio, and I don't know nothing of Palladio. I may know something on Alberti, but what I should say on Alberti would be better said by Peter himself. So that's the end of my statement. But no, I may add just a few words. Alberti, the universal man of the early Renaissance, left an indelible trace in almost every field of human endeavors. Almost everything he did still counts. He invented perspective, cartography, cryptography, the grammar of the Italian language, notations, and many other things. In architecture in particular, one reason why Alberti is important is for a very simple idea he had around 1450, when he said architects should not make buildings. They should make drawings of buildings, notations, which we tend to take for granted, but it was a very revolutionary thing to say at the time, because Alberti separated completely design and making, and said someone should think and make drawings. That's me, meaning Alberti, that's us, and then workers should make, you know, the material, dirty job. So we do not lay bricks, we do not cut stones. We make clean drawings. These clean drawings we give to the workers. The workers climb on the scaffoldings, they get dirty, they fall from the scaffoldings, they die, and this is none of our business. They do that. We think and we do not make. The workers must make, and they cannot think. And this idea created, for better for worse, architecture as an art of design, as an art of notations. Alberti invented our profession as a profession of design. If we are today, everyone in this room, teachers or students in a university where we study architecture, or where we teach architecture, or where we learn architecture, we owe that to Alberti. Without him, we would not be in a university today. We would be craftsmen. We would be, you know, learning our trade in a shop, on a building site, like plumbers or electricians. Nothing against plumbers or electricians. They do an important job, but we do another job. We make notations. We make drawings of buildings. This was a very important idea. Alberti should be proclaimed the holy patron saint of the architectural profession. Without him, we would not exist. That applies to Roman Catholic countries, of course, and to Orthodox countries as well. Now, after that, Alberti actually built some buildings in the 20 last years of his life. And these were not particularly successful nor influential in time. Actually, at the time, they were considered to be very bad. I do not have images here now, but you all know some of these buildings. With a couple of exceptions, they are very strange buildings. They look out of whack, out of proportion, goofy, strange, ungainly. And indeed, soon enough, the commonplace was born, and Vasari formalized it only a couple of generations after Alberti, whereby Alberti was a great thinker, but a bad artist. He was too much of a thinker, perhaps, to be a good designer, too conceptual, too abstract to make good designs. Vasari said it, and this commonplace remained true, basically, until 1 generation ago. But then postmodernists came. And for some inexplicable reason, they fell in love with Alberti. A love without boundaries, without limits. Just let me remind me a few milestones of this tragic story. Alberti's treatise on building was translated into Italian by Paolo Portoghesi. It was translated into French by François Chouet. It was translated into English by Joseph Rickwert, 3 eminent postmodernists and 2 eminent phenomenologists. I do not know who translated Alberti's treatise into German. Perhaps no one did, which is good. Based on this is the kind of stuff that Werner Oechslin could have conceived, but for some reason he never actually tried to find the time to work on it, which is also good. In 1979, just for an anecdotal but meaningful piece of evidence, Joseph Rickwert guest edited an issue of AD, the architectural magazine, on Alberti, where on the first page, Joseph Rickwert said, 1979, Alberti should be a model for every modern, he meant postmodern, designer. Modern designers should learn to imitate Alberti, just like Alberti learned to imitate classical antiquity. And many postmodern architects actually did it. But why? Looking for historical precedent, postmodernists could have found many, and so many that were much better for them. Why should they focus their obsessive attention on this quintessentially modern thinker to convert him, Alberti, into a postmodernist visual icon? If Alberti had known about that, he would probably not have been happy, and is probably quite unhappy in his grave, wherever it be. So this is not a rhetorical question. I do not know why this happened. If anyone has any suggestion, please make it. I will take some notes, because I don't know why that happened. I think it was a major catastrophe, which was hugely detrimental to the reputation of Alberti. I don't care about the postmodernists. They can do whatever they like. But this was the first question, a real question. Then I have a second question, which is a rhetorical question, because I think I know the answer. Why is it that Alberti was and still is so important for Peter? This is not the same reason. It cannot be the same reason why Alberti was so important for the Pomos. It must be another reason. I do not know what's the answer to the first question. I think I know the answer to the second question, but I also know that Peter himself can explain that better than an interpreter, but I could be. So I pass the microphone.
Thank you.